It is my very great pleasure to introduce to you today Professor Peter Bragge, who specialises in evidence reviews to support better decision-making for policy and practice. He is the Director of Monash Sustainable Development Institute's Evidence Review Service, which delivers research and practice reviews to a diverse range of government and industry organisations. He also leads Monash Sustainable Development Institute's collaboration with McMaster University in Canada to build the world's largest evidence resource for the Sustainable Development Goals, social systems evidence. And just this month, Peter was listed as one of, it was news to him, he was listed as one of Australia's top 250 researchers as a field leader in the area of health policy and medical law in the Australian newspaper's Research magazine. Please make him feel welcome.
Thanks very much. And the funny thing about that last thing is they didn't tell me. So when I got the email from the university, I was like, this is probably a mistake because I've never heard anything about it. But anyway, here we are, final talk. Just check that the doors are locked. No, they seem to be open still. But I will be watching with interest on people's movements over the next hour. It's always a bit of an interesting situation when you're the last person, but hope to entertain you in this last hour, and also to present some thought-provoking reflections on what we've heard and a couple of new things. I do want to congratulate, and I'm sure there's going to be some more congratulations after this, everyone who has organised and participated in this conference. It's been a really warm welcome, and I've loved meeting the team from JBI. They're just wonderful people, and coincidentally I was reading a lot of their critical appraisal tools in the plane on the way over because I'm working on a pretty gnarly review at the moment, so it's nice to put some names to faces. And Zoe actually stole my thunder because I was going to say the only thing they haven't done is they haven't ordered a D to put at the end of the Ignite, now that we're all ignited. So that's my mandatory dad joke is done. So let me start with a bit of an apology. So the only thing with the JBI, they're so organised, they asked me to give them the title a few months ago, and then I was sitting in the talks yesterday and I'm like, oh my God, you know, people are saying really clever things. Ruth said clever things, she did the thing with the aeroplane, and then there were people, Maureen and Tari, and I'm kind of like, this is... So I went back to the hotel room and I made a little bit of a change, and I hope no one minds. I just updated it. I thought, what can I do? What can I do here? So my working title for most of yesterday was bunch of reflections about what other people have said with a little bit of a passing reference to impact. And I thought, look, even for this crew at JBI, that's probably a little informal. So I ditched that one as well. And I've gone with this. This is the current title. It probably won't change from this point, to be frank. And actually, you'll think that Tari and I worked together because we worked at Monash. You will think that we collaborated on what she was saying and what I was saying, but I'm actually going to pick up some of the things she said and extend them in different ways. Now, the other thing I've learnt about presenting over the years is you've got to know your audience. And I know it's Friday afternoon, so I've prepared a short poll. I was going to get your top of mind thoughts on what you're actually thinking right now. And I had four options, so I'll go through them quickly. You're moderately annoyed with me because I changed the title of the talk. You're really energised about this last talk and you're up for listening. You're developing some anxiety about how you're going to get to the airport and get home. And the fourth option is you are in a coma because you've been eating Mentos, you've just had scones, and you're frankly unconscious. So can I just have a show of hands for number one? You're moderately annoyed with me for changing the title? Excellent. I'm glad no one made their whole travel plans in Adelaide about, you know, I'm coming to see this talk and now I've changed the title. Number two, you're up for listening? Yes, this is good. Number three, anyone anxious about the airport? I'm up, I can share. Would you like to share a taxi to the airport? I have to go to the airport after this. Be happy to share a cab with you. And well, obviously if you're in a coma, you can't put your hand up, and Tari's filled you up with chocolate, so Right, what's in the top of your mind after 2 days? Just your top of mind thoughts, just yell them out. One word, anyone. Tari will give you a caramello koala. Don't be shy. Evidence, excellent, fantastic. Anyone else? Evidence, engagement, collaboration. What's that? Someone just did this, but I couldn't hear. Can you do it again? Taking it forward, excellent. Anyone else? So much work to do. Okay, thank you very much. That's great. We don't need live polling anyway. Wine. Wine. Now, is it W-H-I-N-E or W-I-N-E? Okay, so let's get down to business. So I work in a unit within an enterprise. It's kind of like a Russian doll, right? So there's Monash University, big university, 10 faculties. They've got a few institutes. I work in one of the big institutes at Monash University called Monash Sustainable Development Institute. As its name suggests, it has a very strong commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. And that meaningfully impacts the work I do, and it meaningfully impacts what I'm going to highlight later on when I talk about impact. There's a lot of entities within Monash Sustainable Development Institute. We have about 200 staff. We're bigger than 2 faculties of the university. Have a bunch of PhD students. We do lots and lots of projects. You can look us up on the interweb. And we have Behaviour Works Australia, which is the largest and oldest applied behaviour change research institute in the country. I've worked there since 2015, and for the last 4 years I've focused on evidence reviews. But you can see we also do a lot in sustainable development education, climate, and we have some big programs of applied research. Fly to Flourish, which is funded by the Paul Ramsay Foundation, to look at bushfire recovery with deep community connection, and the RISE program, which is a very large Wellcome Trust funded program revitalising informal settlements in Indonesia. And if you take nothing else from this slide, just know that MSDI's focus really has stretched me, and it's stretched the work I do in review science. And I have a wonderful team. I mean, I was saying to Tari, it's a bit funny when you say you're a director and there's only like 4.5 staff, but we really do punch above our weight, and I do need to pay credit. We've done about 51 reviews for industry and government and philanthropy in the last couple of years. We have a wonderful information librarian that will not be replaced by AI anytime soon, Tari, Veronica Delafos, and we have a really, really fantastic team, so kudos to them. We do 4 things at the Evidence Review Service. And I'm going to return to this theme, we invest very heavily in question development and prioritisation for reasons that I'll go into detail about, but it's certainly one of my obsessions, you could say, is what's the problem that we're trying to solve, and I think it's chronically underinvested in reviews. Obviously we do desktop reviews, that's why I'm here. We all know what desktop reviews are. We often supplement them with 6 to 8 interviews with practitioners on the ground to understand the contextual relevance of the review. And then I have moderately frustrating arguments with journals about saying, no, we're not trying to do a whole qualitative study. This is bonus points for the desktop review. It's not, you didn't do a whole qualitative study. But I've managed to publish enough now that I can self-cite and I can argue better with journals. So we do a lot of evidence and practice reviews. And we do some teaching and training around evidence synthesis methods. When I say we've worked for a lot of clients, this is just a selection, and it's a combination of some that you would find pretty familiar from the world of health, the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality, Wellcome Trust, Paul Ramsay Foundation I mentioned, but also water authorities, South East Water, the Global Buildings Performance Network. We did a review of sustainable building practices, and other organisations. So I am topic agnostic and methods deep when it comes to reviews, and I'm very fortunate to work at a large university where we can reach out to the topic experts and focus on the review science, which is what I've done for the last few years. So, to the first part of my revised presentation, where are we now? I think we need to take a little bit of a step back, since we're at the last session of the conference, and understand where we've come from. Context really matters. And I know that everybody knows about scurvy I know that everyone knows that James Lind wrote the first real review, but when you drill into the dates and you realise that that was 150 years after the first use of lemon juice and still 45 years before lemon juice was established in the British Admiralty, you do feel a little bit sorry for the poor sailors that sailed between 1601 and 1790 something. And so when we say, you know, we're doing things too slowly and it takes 17 years to get things into practice, let's just remember it used to take about 200 years, okay? And so that's the first thing. That's where we kind of started. We've heard a lot about COVID, and it was fantastic to hear reflections on the real world response to COVID, and we know that people did fantastic things through COVID end, and that the review community, as Tari highlighted, did some incredible stuff around living guidelines. But I do think we have to have a bit of a reality check, and the best reality check is Pearson's article from 2020, How COVID Broke the Evidence Pipeline, which basically said that COVID was also an example of research waste at an unprecedented scale. Lots of underpowered trials that didn't talk to each other. Lots of, frankly, terrible reviews. So we didn't do as well as we could have done, and we need to face that reality as we move forwards. And like Tari, I hope we never do go through another pandemic, but I think that is a bit of a two-sided coin, the COVID question. There's no doubt that researchers did a lot right, but there were some lessons that we need to learn. And where we sit now, there are three things, I guess, to highlight around this timeline, which clearly isn't, it isn't to scale. For those of you who are a little bit anxious about graphs, I'm not really a kind of a quantitative guy, but I'm going to talk about the Global Commission on Evidence, because that's actually what I was asked to talk about 6 months ago, and then I kind of changed it and then changed it again. We've been through all that. Tari has very adequately covered the living review and guidelines space, and she's also talked about review automation, and I've got a couple of other takes on that as well. So that's where we've come from. That's where we are, and that's where we've come from. What is our impact? Well, that's a really good question. I'll start with the quote that I've shared for probably 15 years, since Lee Jong-wook said it at the World Health Organization Summit back in 2005 or 2006. And the thing that really does drive me in my everyday work. Action without knowledge is wasted effort, and knowledge without action is a wasted resource. We all know that. That's why we all get out of bed. But I really have to pay credit to my boss, Liam Smith, at BehaviourWorks when I talk about impact, because while we're patting ourselves on the back at BehaviourWorks saying, wow, that was a great trial of strategies to encourage vaccination, and gee, we did really well with this piece of research, he always said, what happens next? What happens when the researchers leave the party? Have we really changed anything? And I think it's something that researchers need to ask themselves before they get too excited about what they've achieved. And in fact, it led me to invent a project called What's Happened Next, and through that I met the wonderful Maureen Dobbins. It's been an absolute pleasure to meet her in person, and I connected with her through the COVID End listserv and said, listen, I'm kind of keen to know what happens after we give our reviews back to people, and I've basically made up a pretty lo-fi survey. I've collected a few of those surveys. Would you like to collect a few of those surveys using the same question? And she said, sure, that'd be great. And then we both got really busy, and we managed to scrape together about 25 surveys that we'd handed to people about a month after we did the review and said, hey, what happened with that survey? And so I'm shamelessly regifting some slides that I presented at the What Works Global Summit about a month ago to that effect. And I did not steal this image from JBI. I just want to make that absolutely clear. If you go back to the tape of the What Works Global Summit, I used the same image there. It's Shutterstock, it's all freely available. But actually, the reason I chose this image was firstly because the non-photographic images of drops in water were not up to scratch, but also at best count, there's about 200,000 reviews in the world, maybe 250, you could let's say 300 if you want. And when you look at how many, I had a pretty good look, not a systematic look, but I had a pretty good look for user-focused appraisals of reviews when they'd been handed back to the people that the problem was designed to be solved for. and I found not very much. Now, a lot of clinical people will say yes, but we know that guidelines have impact, guidelines have reviews in them, and I absolutely acknowledge that. But there is not nearly enough evaluation of what happened next after we handed a review to a person to help them make a slightly better decision. And that's what we've just carved off a little chunk of that work now, and I want to present it. So, like I said, I totally made this survey up in under an hour because I thought if I don't get started on this, it's going to be one of those nice to have things that gets pushed around to the back. So we haven't validated it, we didn't pilot it, it was kind of a best guess, it's some open-ended questions, some closed questions. And the vision, which has not worked out, but we're going to work on it a bit next year, was to send one survey a month after we delivered a review, and then another one 6 months later, which was a bit of a kind of a shameless, hey, maybe you'd like to update that review, or what's happened since then? But we kind of dropped the ball on sending out the 6-month survey. Maureen's team did a much better job, but we didn't. So I'm just going to present some 1-month survey results. We got 25 responses between the two teams, and this is probably important context for some of the results that I'm going to show. Like, our reviews tend to be about 40, 45 pages. Maureen's team are clearly a little bit more efficient with their words and much better at massaging into shorter documents. And as I indicated earlier, my reviews cover a range of health and non-health topics. So how do we get people back onto public transport after COVID-19? How do we get people to protect their passwords? So I do a lot of stuff that's not really to do with health. And I was pretty happy to see that people generally liked our reviews. I've, in recent years, had much more of an impact, much more of an emphasis in my work on being useful. And as Tari was saying, this is a conversation. Is this useful to you? No. Okay, well, how about an infographic? Would you like to look at this research instead of this research? Which of the aspects of the outcomes are of most interest to you? It's a conversation. And we had that conversation pretty well. And to be frank, from a business point of view, that 9.3 down the bottom, that's called a Net Promoter Score. That basically means that people like us enough to say, yeah, I reckon Peter or Maureen's team could do a good job in this review. And that's important. Now, this is the thing that kind of surprised me. I always thought, these people, they're so busy. I invested very heavily in infographics and executive summaries because I thought that's all that people would read. And I was quite surprised to find, small sample of course, most people read all of it. The don't know is a bit of a worry, but most people read fairly long reports. And I think that's an assumption that we need to challenge, about how much people engage. And in our survey, we actually had a sub-question on what are the sections of the report that you read? And the number 2 next to executive summary was the reference list. The reference list, the thing that I never thought anyone looked at except another reviewer to see if their review had been cited. They were like, I want to see what this research is that you're talking about. We once had a conversation about, the reference is very long. Maybe we could shorten it by not having the references in there. No, not a good idea. Generally, nearly half of them are shared. That's good to know. They're good enough to put on a web page somewhere and share with others. The thing that really blew me away is that nearly half of them were referenced in other documents. And I think that is important because it means that the review is impactful enough to be referenced in something else that was going somewhere else. And this is in a fairly short time frame after delivering the review. And some of these comments show how our review reports fed into other documents and informed important decisions. And we must get more data on this as a review community, so that firstly, because it feels good to get good feedback, but secondly, we need to have that legitimacy about our impact going forwards. As I said, most people found the format appropriate. They like the readability of the tables, which frankly I don't. I always think we could do better on tables. The quote in the middle really sticks out to me, and I think this really goes back to what we were saying about what I said about people reading the whole report. I don't think any section of the report could be removed. These are 44-page average reports, and they're saying, no, we want all of that stuff. So at the end of the day, and Maureen's pretty cynical about infographics, I think it would be fair to say. And, you know, infographics take a long time to do, and I'm not sure now, seeing that data, seeing the reports being shared and referenced and being read and seeing that people read the reference list, I'm not really sure that the infographics are worth the investment that we had made in them. They're kind of cool and they look good, and I think they are a handy thing to have, but they're not a must-have. And we were really gratified by the engagement. So, what do we need to do differently? Paying credit to Simon French, who wrote the fabulous article about who needs to do what differently, which drives a lot of our work at Behaviour Works. So the first thing we need to do, as I think I've made clear, but just in case I haven't, I've put 2 exclamation marks and a highlighter pen, do more evaluations of our review work. And if you would like to use my survey, all I ask in return is that you put the data into our back end. We will only present the data in consolidated form. Please use the survey we've made. Please make it better. Please share data. And maybe when we go to Copenhagen next year, we'll have 50 or 75 or 100 evaluations to present. We need a global effort here to bring together the what happened next story. And I hope that Qualtrics survey works better than my Menti poll, but please join our effort. And as I said, I'll give you the survey, you give me back the data. I promise I won't tell, you know, well, like obviously people say bad things too, but we'll share it all in a really, in a way that doesn't identify the institutions. Now, I've got a 16-year-old daughter and a 13-year-old son, so I spend a lot of my time saying, it's not all about you, you know. And I'm going to throw a bit of a bomb in the room here at JBI and say it's not all about health. I am working in areas outside of health, and there are not nearly enough tools or processes or understanding about how to do that. This is a map of peatland, right? This is what happens in peatland. What's peatland? I'm not entirely sure. I'm a review methodologist, but it's a very important part of the ecosystem, and it has a lot of environmental benefits, and people need to be able to look after it well because of climate change. So I worked with a wonderful team at the School of Biology at Monash, and and I said, you know, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And they said, well, it's kind of complicated, and they drew this. Okay, so there's no people in there. So we're not talking case control studies, we're not talking randomised controlled trials, although that is possible in nature. But you can still draw in a useful evidence map. I can give this to a professional, a forester, and he can look at it and say, it looks like re-wetting, has some pretty good evidence around the hydrology. I don't know what hydrology is. I'm not even entirely sure what re-wetting is, right? But I know there's a fair bit of evidence, and I know that I can build an evidence map that helps a practitioner. But the most common thing that happens when I talk to people from other disciplines is they go, oh, your whiz-bangy medical review methods won't work with us because, you know, we're not nearly as evidence-based as the healthcare system. And I kind of like go, well, you might be surprised to know, but that's another story. But really, this is a big problem in the field. Collaboration for Environmental Evidence is doing a great job, but the one thing we need to know is it's not all about health. I've written 2 pretty cool reviews on sustainable health systems. One got written up in the BMJ, which is the closest I'll get to being written up in the BMJ. And one was done for the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare. And this is a really important cross-disciplinary challenge, you know, where you're talking about energy use, you're talking about procurement, you're talking about what does it mean if you turn an autoclave off, how much power do you save? And when you're evaluating the empirical evidence on this, you're kind of improvising a little bit around how you review that. But these transdisciplinary challenges are the challenges of our time, and you know, the transdisciplinary research is the thing that's going to help to solve some of these complex challenges. So we need to be able to step up to the plate on that. My real obsession is about questions, and I want to get philosophical on a Friday afternoon, but I don't think reviewers think enough about where questions come from. I mean, if you're doing a PhD and you have to do a review, it's driven by your PhD review topic. But these are the 4 questions I take to most clients that I interact with when I'm drawing up a tender or understanding a request. Who wants to know the answer and what do they want to do with it? Really matter and really affect how I go about my work. What is already known and decided tells me about the political context, and it allows me an opportunity to say, no, I will not find evidence to support this thing that you're doing. I will give you a neutral rendering of the evidence around a question that relates to that thing that you're doing. And I need to know what the other decision-making inputs are, and we'll get to that later. I came up with this weird dad jokey sort of thing about describing how we do our work at the Evidence Review Service, which is about takeoffs and landings, which is why we have the aeroplane, right? So I think that the takeoff is very, very neglected. And like 2 out of the 5 things in our model of how we work, which is freely available via that very long link, but you could just look BehaviourWorks method book, or go to the BehaviourWorks website, download chapter 1, is understanding the context and scope and getting the question right. This is a huge conundrum in the era of rapid reviews, because what generally happens is people go, look, we don't have time to sit around for an hour and a half working out what the question is, you know, we've got to get an answer. And the conundrum is, the less time you have, the more important the question is, because you do not have time to turn that plane around if you're due to send a review back in 2 weeks. So I insist on meeting with clients for at least an hour and often longer, and understanding exactly what the problem is they're trying to solve. And as you would know, which is, I know that you know this, which is why the type is so small, but in the book chapter, we know that what is a problem question, we need to look at observational epidemiological data. A what works question, we're looking at trials. How might this work? We might be looking at theory of change. What risks are present? We're looking at completely different bodies of literature. And then when I say that to mostly government clients, they're like, well, actually, we would actually like a review on all of those things, please. And then I say, would you like to give me 5 times as much money? And then they say, oh, can't you just do them all in the one review? And then I say, we need to prioritise. Another area of science that is neglected, and which we've done some really cool stuff on. This is a paper that's in press, where we prioritised $34 million of funding through the MRFF for cardiovascular and diabetes research in Australia. We did a national survey, we generated hundreds of ideas, we deduplicated them into a long list, and then we did this weird thing where you think about the criteria by which you're going to prioritise. So if I ask you what your top 3 priorities are for your area of work, you can probably name them, and it's like, how did you arrive at that top 3? Well, were you looking at return on investment? Were you looking for feasibility? Were you looking for political expediency? Were you looking for et cetera, et cetera? And in about 45 minutes, you can get people to rank a list of 30 ideas using 4 or 5 prioritisation criteria. You can spit it back to them using a platform that is better than Mentimeter, which doesn't work, and you can put that on Twitter, and I've paid a subscription. And you can say, well, okay, if you're taking a return on investment lens, these are the top 3. If you're taking a feasibility lens, these are the top 3. Some of them rise to the top in multiple categories. You can weight them. They might say, look, I think clinical importance should be worth twice as much. Sure, let's make that worth twice as much. Here's your master list. Let's go. Really, really simple, very, very important, not done much. So that's number 4. I also put that in highlights because I thought that might be a good way of emphasising how important it is. Now, I said I'd return to the Global Commission on Evidence, and we've got 2 hours to go in this talk. Yeah, it's a bit longer than, it's okay, well, you won't miss a plane. So one of the great things that happened out of COVID end was a group of really cool people, including Maureen and led by John Lavis in Canada, because the Canadians do all the good stuff, released a report called the Global Commission on Evidence to Address Societal Challenges. They could have come up with a punchier title, frankly, but there it is. The Global Evidence Commission. Last year, they released an update and identified these 3 priorities. And so I think we need to be aware of what's happening in this global initiative, because it's probably the biggest effort of its type. So the first is to understand that demand side and those inputs and those questions that I posed earlier in our domestic evidence support systems, i.e. our governments and other actors that use evidence. The second is to enhance and leverage the global evidence architecture, which plays very strongly into Tari's living evidence talk, and I'm not going to talk about that much. And the third is to address the deluge of misinformation that citizens and others who are not researchers are faced with, which is an enormous challenge and one that we need to be aware of and try and meet. So they did this thing called the light bulb diagram, which is my favourite representation of everything that goes through a policymaker's mind when they're making a decision. And I think, you know, a lot of researchers sometimes lose sight of the fact that actually your evidence synthesis is pretty cool, but it's actually not the most important thing. And, you know, when we were looking at the aeroplane flying across the stage, you know, you need to walk around to the front of those people and say, what's on the table for you? Where are you getting your information from? In COVID, a lot of it was modelling. There was a fair bit on qualitative insights about what's acceptable, and so on and so on. So when policymakers are faced with challenges, they have a couple of things going through their mind. One is they haven't got much time, particularly in COVID, and the other is they've got to take account of all these inputs. And the third one is that the minister's probably going to have a view, and that's just a political reality. But we haven't done very well on incentivising demand for evidence support. There's a pretty cool effort in New South Wales where they require a public interest test for new legislation, but it's kind of voluntary and we're not really sure what the impact is, and you know, these things tend to get gained and it's not systematically embedded. So a group of us, including myself, are sitting on a global panel across 12 or 13 countries to understand where the problem sits and where the decision makers are. And so in Australia, is it the Productivity Commission? Is it the Royal Commissions? Is it the Senate committees? Is it your local MP? Is it the Prime Minister and Cabinet's office? It's probably all of those things, depending on what the problem is. And they're doing some great work, which is not finished, and in my case, not funded. So if anyone has a bunch of money they'd like to give me for that, come and see me afterwards. And this is a little bit of a diagram of what needs to happen. So it's essentially an ecosystem diagram, a bit of a tell them they're dreaming diagram, I guess, to refer to Tari's talk. And incidentally, there is a scene in the castle where there's a thing called the Trading Post, and in the old days they had this newspaper where they sold stuff and they wrote down, and there is, I kid you not, there is a scene where one of the sons says to his dad, "What's a lectern, Dad?" Because someone was selling a lectern. Anyway, that's just something for you to enjoy when you watch The Castle. Because I'm leaning on a lectern and she talked, anyway, all right, okay. So you can see there's a lot of moving parts here that have to come together. Global evidence architecture, reducing duplication of effort, all the things we've talked about, all the things about why the publication model's broken, all the things about not reproducing effort. This is all freely available in the Global Evidence Commission report. I know it's a complicated diagram for Friday, but we have to try and tackle this. And speaking of complicated diagrams, here's another one that I'm not going to talk about that much, but really which does go to that issue of efficiency and duplication of effort. And this is the enhancing and leveraging of the global evidence architecture. And living reviews are a big part of this agenda. What are the 100 questions that we need to, you know, really focus our efforts on as a global community? So I'll leave you to read that in your own time on the aeroplane. The thing that I quite like, which is probably the least mature of the three priorities, is how do we help our citizens through this maze that we find difficult as researchers? I'm doing a review at the moment. I think I've had to read some of the methods sections 5 times to work out what the study design was and draw a picture, and even then I'm not 100% sure. And so what happens when you're prescribed a pill that you don't understand? What happens when your doctor tells you to do something or recommends surgery for, you know, something that we know surgery doesn't work for? And this is another thing that I think we need to think about. The only answers I think we have at the moment are science communication. I get out in the media a bit sometimes and talk about stuff. There are people that do that sort of thing. But we have to remember, and I think Tari's point about the AI making this a little bit more tractable is going to be very important, because frankly, people like me are not the best people to be explaining this stuff to, you know, listeners on the radio station. But if I could achieve one thing in the back end of my career, it would be, please stop searching Google to find credible knowledge. This is my version of an evidence pyramid. Now, someone was very upset about evidence pyramids. I can't remember, was it? Yes, yeah. So this is mine. The bottom is the cesspool, right? And I did look up, this is a little bit out of date, but there's about 5 billion pages of stuff on the internet. So that's fantastic. If you want to find a restaurant, great, go right ahead. But it's just the cesspool. Last time I tried to work out how many research articles there are in the world, and that you can see all the references there. Again, you can probably add 10 million, but let's call it 75 million. Let's call it 100 million. How many orders of magnitude less than 5 billion is 100 million, right? For a caramello koala, I'll get back to you at the end. And then again, let's imagine it's 300,000 evidence reviews. How many orders of magnitude less is that? We've got platforms, we've got Cochrane, we've got Campbell, we've got Collaboration for Environmental Evidence, and yet pretty much every government department you walk into, where do you go to find your knowledge? Oh, I look up Google. Can we at least get them to look at Google Scholar instead of Google? Maybe, right? Just add Scholar, it's just one word. But this is a big problem. No one is starting at the top of the pyramid, apart from the people in our circles that know this stuff, the people who write the guidelines. The people out on the street and the journalists and the policy makers who want to know something about research, they're at the bottom, 99 times out of 100. Right, we're nearly at the end. Great book. Have not had permission to use that image. It's the one image I made a bit of a late decision to include it. So again, if you could maybe keep that out of Twitter, it's probably going to be helpful, because Mr. Seuss or his estate will probably sue me. But as Tari said, where could we go? The word could is chosen quite deliberately because it is about where we decide we want to go. So I want to offer a couple of thoughts towards the end on automation/AI. And I mapped this to what we do, because one of the questions I get asked a lot is, will the machines do all your work? As Tari said. So I had a bit of a think about it and I thought, well, not yet. And furthermore, the very elegant thing about my obsession with questions and context is it's probably the hardest thing for AI to tackle. So you see, I don't think automation is very well geared to understanding context and questions and problems in the way that Tari described her interactions with the expert committee, and then the conversations I have when I'm saying, yeah, but what's the real problem that you want to solve? There is a thing called prompt engineering, which is starting to make AI a bit more two-way. At the moment, ChatGPT originally was kind of like you type a question, it gives you the answer. But what you really need to make that question development right is you need a two-way exchange of views with like the chatbot that you see on the bank. What can I help you with? And I usually just, to be honest, if you want to get straight through to a real person, you just write a bunch of crap and they're like, oh, I don't think that doesn't seem to be in my system. You just kind of type a few X's or something, but not, yeah, anyway, we'll get back to that later. Sure, when you've got 10,000 citations, as Tari said, the machines are already sifting and sorting them using natural language processing. It's taking away stuff. I think we just have to be a little bit less OCD about, oh, we might miss a study or two, and just accept that we could probably use our time better than going through 10,000 citations individually. Could AI do quality appraisal? Not with the reporting the way it is at the moment, as we heard this morning. There's no way that they're going to be able to find the information to make nuanced judgments on, you know, whether randomisation was done, you know, through a calendar method or through a true randomisation, whatever. But it's feasible that, you know, maybe that could happen. And can a chatbot sit down with 6 specialists and ask them nuanced questions about the evidence they've found and what it means in their local context? Probably not yet. So I'm feeling pretty good. I'm 51, got maybe 15 years to go. I think at least some of those tasks will remain human-centred tasks. Now, Tari did talk about the data in, data out. And what I did in the break, I thought, this is such a good idea. I'm going to just draw a little diagram about it. And so I've done this just on the break. I had a little bit of help from a guy called Nakagawa who wrote this in 2020. And it is kind of a bit towards that bigger picture. It's a phenomenal paper, and it is totally the tell them their dream and paper. So you've got on the right, you've got, my favourite is research data available for synthesis even when unpublished, which is the green square about halfway down. Empiricists and synthesis collate evidence together, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that it's great that, as Tari said, smarter people than us are thinking about these data challenges, and certainly, just as you wouldn't, you know, if you started a university now, why would you have faculties when everything is a transdisciplinary challenge? You probably wouldn't. If you started publishing now, you wouldn't have PDFs being flown across the stage and data extracted and re-abstracted. So that's the bigger picture. Now, where could we go? And I have to tell you, this bit is not going to work because the Mentimeter is not working, and I had a really cracking idea for ending this whole conference where we were going to build a word cloud of everything. And so if the tech guys can help me make that happen, that'd be great. But the future that I want to see is that we actually take a bit more time to think about what it is that we're trying to do. And actually, it's funny when people talk about, oh, but the governments want, you know, they want the answer in 2 weeks. If you say, look, I can get you a better answer in 4 weeks or 5 weeks, as I have said with this review I'm doing, that's doing my head in because there's 81 included studies, they'll be like, yeah, okay, we'll see if we can make that work. So it's still a negotiation. Better research literacy, I think we've talked about. More review impact evaluation. I look forward to all my new collaborators joining my Lo-Fi survey project to make the world understand the impact that we have and legitimise our work. And machines do the boring stuff. Now, some people, as Tari alluded to, their imagined future is machines do everything. I don't think that's my imagined future, and I was going to say, go to Menti, and then I had a slide lined up, which I believe is not going to work because it's not going to animate, where we were going to talk about your future. But we might roll that into the Q&A, because I think that a good way to finish a conference is to hear from the people at the conference about what they think the future is. And I had a thing that I was going to do while you were using the Mentimeter. I've got a bit of a mission. So I play a bit of music in my spare time, and I am in fact a verified Spotify artist. And I've decided next year I want to double my monthly listeners in every conference. I'm sitting at 10, right? 10. There's what, 100 people here, right? Just click. I want to get back to Melbourne tonight and have 20 monthly listeners. Now, it's not music for everyone. It's just jazz standards with a bit of a twist, a little bit of solo piano improvisation, a little bit of just, you know, chilled out music that you can work to. I've just released Send in the Clowns. I've got about half a dozen tracks on there. So I am shamelessly using the remainder of my career to transition from academia to being a full-time musician, and this is where I've started, at JBI Ignite. And this is another little screen grab of, I did a fairly serviceable version of Auld Lang Syne last year on the piano, and since it's coming up to Christmas, if you do go onto Spotify and double my listener base from 10 to 20, if you look for the one with the candle image, it's kind of a version of Auld Lang Syne. So, on that note, thank you very much again for. I don't think anyone left the room during this talk, which is a great credit to you, and thank you again to the organisers for this very generous invitation to present today. I hope I've given you a couple of things to think about as you either stay on in Adelaide for the weekend or as you travel back to various parts of the world, and thank you again. How did I go for time? Not bad.
Good.
Thank you.
Is that working?
Yeah.
Is that working? Yeah? Okay. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
That was great.
Good. I hope you'd tell me if it was crap.
After.
Because I do like
Not
feedback.
here.
I mean, I've done the survey, right? So if you thought it was rubbish, I'm happy to improve next time.
Let's get into some questions.
Okay.
Shall we?
Yes.
And I'm going to kick it off. actually I'm not, because I saw one that I thought was interesting on the app before.
Good.
Around how can we, what are your thoughts around how we can make better quality evidence available to citizens? Because it's often behind a paywall or not accessible. So when they're going searching on Google Scholar, and they might, if they think savvy,
Yes.
they might go there and they might find something that's a bit higher quality, but often when they click on that, it's not available. So what can we do about that?
So I think there's a number of things. I mean, I think some citizens will go to the lengths of finding the research, but generally they'll rely on summaries from trusted institutions. I still think that Cochrane's plain language summaries of reviews are still amongst the gold standard for just making sense to people. I think Tari's point about how AI could change the game there is important. And I think not everyone likes being a science communicator, but as an evidence review community, I think part of our responsibility is to communicate what we find out by doing all that hard work. Now, there are some ways that's done. There's sort of fact-checking type things. RMIT runs a fact-checking, for those of you who are not in Australia. You know, when a politician says something contentious, there's like this fact-checker that says, actually, it's not true that, 90% of Australians think this or that. So there are avenues that kind of leap over that paywall. I just want to add my voice to those of everyone else who said that the publishing model is broken. I am frankly fed up with reviewing stuff for free so that Springer Nature can make $1 billion, and that's why I'm not doing it anymore. So maybe the paywalls will be a thing of the past with preprints and things, but I think we need to all make a few efforts, and collectively those efforts can help.
So we've been talking quite a lot about AI. It's come up on a number of occasions, and several of the presentations, including yours. And we all seem to agree that we're not quite there yet with AI. But at the moment, we are still challenged to deliver evidence syntheses faster.
Yes.
And so what are some of the challenges around that now, and how do you manage them?
So as I indicated towards the end of the talk, I do try to negotiate, particularly if an institution comes to our service for a review to solve a problem that they have, then you've kind of got some negotiating power because they're the ones that need the problem solved. So that's number one. The second thing, which I think is why I focus so much on question development, is if you're really smart with your question development, you can shape the parameters of the review so you're not wasting your time and then going back a week saying, look, we've had a bit of a look around and it looks like there isn't much on this. I often preload that conversation by saying, if we can't find stuff on this, are you happy for us to go down this road? So getting a bit of a pre-approval. And the other thing that I say a lot is that, sure, we can deliver something in a few days. Here are the caveats that are attached to that. We're only looking at the last 2 years of research. We're only looking at particular study designs. You need to know that there's risk involved in that. And if you were to invest for a few more weeks, there would be less caveats and less risk. And then obviously if you invest for a few more months, you get more robust. So we need to be honest about that. And I think we need to try not to overpromise something that's quick without making it very clear what the limitations of that are.
Okay. We had some discussion on this bit yesterday around methodological development, and I was talking to Ruth, I think, in one of the breaks, and I was talking about the fact that I'd gone to the GIN conference in Toronto last year, and I sat in the audience listening to some very sophisticated science around systematic review methodology. Mm-hmm. And my concern is, I was very impressed, way over my head, but my concern is the further we go down the rabbit hole of science, do we risk looking at evidence, looking at research evidence so closely and with such a critical eye that we render all of it useless. So do we need more research on reviews? And if so, what do you think that looks like?
So I think it looks a little bit more lo-fi, and I use the word lo-fi jokingly when I talk about the survey, but the fact is, if I'd spent 3 months developing a survey, I wouldn't have been able to present those results, right? And fundamentally, I think the job of a reviewer is find relevant evidence, make an attempt to sift and sort it into the studies that are generally of higher quality, the studies that are generally of lower quality, and tell a story about what the studies of higher quality show. There's so many nuances within that, and I think, yes, it is possible that you can do very sophisticated analysis and arrive at a slightly more accurate endpoint. But then, as Ruth was saying, if we're sitting around polishing the perfect review, and it's, I think it was Ruth, it might have been someone else, and it's one day too late to influence practice, then we've kind of lost, right? And so I think that there's always compromises to be made. There's always more you could do in the sophistication of appraisal and analysis, but you have to go back to what is it that we're actually trying to do, what's the problem that we're trying to solve, and how much time have we got to do it.
Again, going back to the public,
Yes.
Maureen submitted a question, thanks Maureen, around how we get the public interested in looking at research, as many are not interested in doing this at all.
So, again, the Spotify thing is a bit of a joke, but one of the things that I think is a little bit underappreciated is the role of the arts in promoting or stimulating thought or encouraging people to think about things they hadn't thought about before. And whilst I don't propose that we put all of our reviews to music, that video presentation yesterday was the most stunning explanation of that concept that I have seen. And people can watch a 2-minute video, people can look at that picture that Ruth showed on day one of the equality and that was shown on day one of the difference between equality and equity. And so I think we need to be a bit cleverer with the mediums that we use, and not just infographics, which I think is one way, but you've got to remember, we've got to engage people that have absolutely no idea what we do, have never looked at a research article, may never look at a research article, but we need to engage them in some way to encourage them to ask their local doctor, why are you prescribing that drug? Or do you really think I need that surgery?
I'm just going to take a moment to read a comment that Ruth has put in.
Oh God, someone's put a comment in, not a question.
Just a comment.
Dang.
That South Africa does have a mandated requirement that all new or amended policy goes through reviews that include the evidence for or against the proposed policy and how it impacts on different socioeconomic groups and on the environment.
Please send me information about that so I can make our country do the same thing. And thank you for letting me know, because I think that is, review communities tend to talk about what they do, which is very supply side focused, but the demand side is the avenue to the problem solving.
I'm just going to check in with the audience to see if we've got any questions.
The session's not due to finish for another 24 minutes, so I'm happy to, I don't think anyone should leave before then.
There is a question that I want to ask, but it's not something that you've talked about.
Okay, good. Fire away.
Are you feeling brave?
Yes.
Because you've done a lot of work in the SDG space.
Yes.
And we've had some discussion about that earlier in the week at our meeting.
Yep.
And as you know, we've started to think about that a little bit more in JBI, and certainly I know that Cochrane and Campbell are doing the same.
Yes.
What are the risks of focusing on the SDGs or using the SDGs as a mechanism for prioritising reviews?
So the only risk really, which I think is quite minor, is that clearly we're approaching 2030 and there will be a post-SDG agenda, but I fundamentally don't think that the challenges that the SDGs represent are going to change. So I think that it's as good a way as any of thinking about the challenges we face as a globe. At the What Works Global Summit last month, the United Nations presented on the SDG Synthesis Coalition, which I don't know if you're aware of, but people might want to look it up. There is now finally a group that are saying, hey, we're actually really in danger of not meeting pretty much any of the SDGs. Perhaps we should have a look at the evidence about what might work, which I know, I say that frustratingly because John Lavers was talking about this when we launched social systems evidence in 2019, was like, you know, I wish these groups that are sort of saying this is all the things we need to do would engage with the world's best available knowledge on how to get there.
Okay. Do we have any questions from the audience? Yep.
Thanks. Peter, again, this is something you haven't really spoken about, but seeing that we're going around the edges here, you do lots of reviews, clearly, you and your team, and you spoke about getting the question right and the negotiations that you do right at the start towards what's achievable, how we're going to get to the answer, something usable, workable.
Yep.
Have you worked with the knowledge brokers before? I guess kind of the model that the SACS uses here in Australia, for example. And what are your thoughts about that as a value add or the like?
Yeah, I've done, I think it's a really important function to have an intermediary that can carry that conversation. And in fact, we're doing our third SACS review for the year. And I think there's pluses and minuses. So I think having someone as an intermediary to say, okay, the New South Wales Ministry of Health wants this answered, and then attaching a budget to it and encouraging people to come to the plate is really useful. Where it gets a little bit clunky, only because our model is very much, because the way Behaviour works is we're almost always facing the client directly. So sometimes that can get in the way of just, you know, who do I pick up the phone to at the ministry to just ask a quick question, and you have to go through that. So I think that the role of knowledge brokers is absolutely critical in understanding context and formulating questions. Our particular model is a bit more direct, but it's a really critical role in the evidence ecosystem. And when those institutions are well established, they have incredible networks that help us get to that evidence ecosystem question challenge that I was talking about before.
Got a question?
Oh, God. We don't really have to go for another 24 minutes. That was actually a joke.
Oh. So I was reflecting while you were presenting, and it was a fantastic presentation, thank you, about this same stage, about getting the question right. So when we do evidence maps with government, it can take, like 6 months is the absolute longest we've ever taken. And the first 3 months is developing the question.
Yeah.
And it's fortunately led by government colleagues, not us, but it's called the matchmaking process. So they will line up experts. If we've got an evidence expert, they find an internal one. If we've got a housing expert, they find an internal one.
Yeah.
And then we spend ages developing the framework with them in lots of detail. What are the interventions? What are the outcomes? What's the process? Are you sure? Do we all understand the same meaning, etc.?
Yep.
And what I'm wondering is how far, when you develop the question, down what we would call a protocol, do you go? Are you actually talking about how to scope the intervention, what outcomes you're going to consider, etc.?
In many cases, yes. And I think that the process you describe, because you've got that scale of doing the evidence map, you obviously have to define the map and the boundaries and the rows and columns. If you imagine that we're doing one cell in that evidence map, I'll give you an example of a review we did last year for our work cover, our workers' compensation scheme in Victoria. Sorry, this is very awkward. It feels like I'm trying to talk to you and like there's someone sitting in the middle seat of a plane and it's like, so I'm just going to move forwards a little bit. But so they wanted to know about the use of cannabinoids for chronic pain. And we were contracted to do the review with them. We immediately got on the phone to an expert in cannabinoids who'd literally been to the cannabinoid in chronic pain conference. And we drew her into the meeting and we interfaced that expert with the client. And yes, it sometimes does get down to, and the SACS Institute's great at doing this, the operational, when you say this, do you mean this? And even, some of those conversations can be, when you say evidence, right? We talk about peer-reviewed evidence, but people in government, evidence is like what Ruth said at the Royal Commission. That's evidence because they have a very legal, they're often using a legal definition of evidence. So even the idea that's actually, no, we're looking at research papers in journals, you sometimes have to have that conversation. When we have the initial conversation, I've usually pre-written the first few pages of the standard protocol that we would submit to Open Science Framework, but which we often forget to do, but I use their framework anyway. And I show them the inclusion and exclusion criteria and say, when we come across something that does this, we're going to exclude that. Is that okay for you? So it's fairly granular, and that's why it takes a long time. And clients sometimes find it a little bit frustrating. They're kind of like, shouldn't you be like the researcher that's the expert in this? And it's like, I can't be helpful to you if we don't have this conversation. So yeah, the short answer is, in that open access book chapter, I actually go through a whole question development process of all the questions we ask, including who wants to know the answer, what do they want to do, how much money have they got, all of that. And we use most of those, and that actually also drives our decisions about, okay, do we need to do a practice review here? Because this is something where the context matters, and we make a lot of those decisions. And when I'm putting in tenders, I actually say the proposed starting question is.
You know, it's interesting because this week, well, I've been in Australia and I go home tomorrow. The CEO in my email is wanting a review on the use of medical scribes within the next 3 weeks.
Yes.
So the first week is in Australia. So I'm back at work on Monday. So going through this process of wanting the results in 3 weeks, when I doubt very much I'd even get into a dialogue with her before the end of those 3 weeks, is then how do I approach this in terms of potential topics that come up, do more of a scoping and then work from there more logically of these are the areas that you could ask about, because as you say, people don't know what they don't know of how
Correct.
to ask it.
Yeah, and I mean, so the way that I would generally go about that is I'd just start drawing up a protocol, and I'd say, well, medical scribes exist in emergency departments, they exist in private practices, they exist in, do you want to focus on a particular branch of medicine or a particular setting, or do you want to know about medical scribes generally? Because if you want to know about them generally, we're probably going to be looking for reviews because we won't have time to look for studies in all of those areas individually. Otherwise, maybe we could sit down and prioritise. Okay, emergency department's the thing we think we need most, blah, 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 and then you'll have a discussion about money and timelines.
Yeah. So good. I've really appreciated your conversation today and your advisements. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And just for the rest, we're going to pass the microphone to everyone in the room. They're all going to ask a question before we leave.
We've got time for one more question. I think it's down here.
Solves it then. So I understand how you've, I guess, used expert opinions, consumer opinions, users' opinions in the protocol stage. My experience is that once we offer the evidence, it will be accepted only if it's fairly consistent with, with priors and, what people are, put it gently, the evidence is struggling with, when it's conflicting with opinions, with pressures, with the sector.
Yes, yep.
Do you have some thoughts on how to synthesize that form of evidence with the research evidence?
I have some thoughts about the limitations of what we do, which go back to the light bulb. And so I try to be very careful not to venture into the territory of the decision maker. And so if you take the example of COVID, right, there was no evidence. They relied a lot on modelling. There was a lot of offline conversations that Ruth described very nicely earlier. And so I think our job as evidence synthesis experts is to do the best thing we can to draw a picture of the knowledge as it is. And I actually quite like the point where I hand it over and say, look, you need to make a decision. I've done my job. I've done everything I can to describe what's there. The answer might not be the answer you were looking for. The answer might be there's not much research. So firstly, there's all the other inputs in the light bulb. And then as Tari touched on, which is also in the light bulb, there's the opinion of the experts on the ground about what may have worked that hasn't been published yet, right? Because we've got publication lag. And so a good policy maker or decision maker will draw all of those inputs together, and I will be quite open in saying I am not, we call, even when we write our reports, we say commentary on the evidence, not recommendations. We're very, very careful that someone's not going to appropriate our work and try and hide behind it, because their job is to make the decision. So I think that's a very important thing to think about.
All I'm going to add is textual evidence synthesis.
Oh, hello. What a nice, if that's the final words of the whole conference, that's a pretty good spot to end, right?
Look, Peter, honestly, I think we could talk all afternoon.
I could talk all afternoon. Who wants to stick around?
I'm really, really grateful for you coming and spending some time with us. But we do have some other things to get to. So I'm going to close it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Oh, the chocolates. Thank you.